this. It's a great pleasure to have two speakers with us today. One, Dr. Elena Kempf, all the way from California, and Dr. Richard Dunley from UNSW in Canberra is with us. We're broadcasting this live to my graduate class, these wonderful people here, who you won't be able to see, but they will be listening and they will be thinking up some questions. This is our fourth Weapons, Wounds and Warfare event. We've been hosting the War in Context Hub here at the University of Auckland, has been hosting these almost fortnightly, sometimes weekly, as an international speaker series, thinking about the complex relationships between warfare, weapons, and the violence those weapons create, often thinking about it in terms of bodies and wounding. And I know for a fact that I'm very excited to have you both speak on something that I think about sometimes a lot, about warfare at sea and the violence of technological innovation and the concepts of humanity and international law that come with it. So I would like to suggest that Richard speaks first, since this kind of chronological, 20 minutes followed by some questions, and then Elena, if you speak second, the same thing, 20 minutes followed by some questions. Does that sound okay? Perfect. So we will now mute me and unmute you and allow Richard to start.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about the Royal Navy and underwater weapons, and in particular reflecting on this question around what makes a weapon somehow acceptable. And this fits into, hopefully, I think anyway, this sort of theme of this seminar series around the wounds and the harm done by weapons, and this complex set of things that allow us to say that certain weapons and ways of fighting are somehow acceptable and others are taboo. And this has been discussed at some length in various places, most notably in regard to chemical weapons and chemical warfare. But there's sort of other elements to this that are perhaps less well explored. And underwater weapons offer a really interesting insight into some of these dynamics, particularly because of the way they did have this sort of element of taboo about them, but it's largely nowadays at least faded. Okay, so I'm going to start with a quote, and it's quite a well-known sort of statement. This is by Captain A.T. Mahan, who is a very famous American naval historian and strategist. He was the naval delegate at the Hague Peace Conference in 1899, the American naval delegate. And in this discussion, they were talking about banning weapons, including poison gas and submarines. And it's recorded that he said that asphyxiating shells did not exist, were not even thought of, and if invented would be far less inhumane than the employment of submarine boats, whose avowed modus operandi was to approach stealthily by night and sink a ship with all her sleeping crew without the faintest hope of saving life. He protested against authorizing the wholesale asphyxiation by water and prohibiting a limited asphyxiation by air. Now, since then, obviously, chemical weapons have become one of the few sort of real taboos of warfare. If we think back to Syria, it's a few years back now, but the use of chemical weapons was one of the things that sparked American and broader Western intervention. Whereas submarines and underwater weapons more generally, as I hinted at earlier, have become very much sort of almost universally accepted. And within this, when we think about sort of the banning of weapons or the prohibiting of the use of weapons in certain circumstances, we do tend to nowadays focus very much on this case of what damage is caused by it. But the discussion at The Hague sort of that surrounds this quote from Mahan highlights that in the early 20th century, this was only one of the considerations that was at play. And two other considerations in the immediate context of this quote are pulled out, and we'll play with them a little bit later on. The first is whether the weapon furthers the cause of the belligerent. In the expressions of the time, it could not be uselessly cruel. A weapon could potentially be cruel, but it could not be uselessly cruel, which is quite an interesting distinction. And the second is whether it operates in bad faith or is somehow seen as being treacherous. And in particular, the latter of these categories we'll come back to again and again. So what I'm going to do is briefly talk through, and this is very much a helicopter view of some of the responses of the Royal Navy to underwater weapons, and particularly some of the more kind of moral responses rather than the specific technological elements. Over the course of the 19th century and leading up into the First World War, and then have a look at a couple of examples at the end about questions as to where these sort of legal limits might be placed on these weapons, and what it is that was considered the factors driving the requirement for there being these kind of legal limits. Okay, so some of the first responses, the first sort of occasions when the Royal Navy gets caught up in underwater weapons, or underwater weapons are used against them, is actually at the beginning of the 19th century as part of the War of 1812 against the Americans. And one of the earliest cases I found was in 1813, and the admiral who was in charge writes back to London, sort of bemoaning that a most melancholy event, the loss of a most gallant officer and 10 brave seamen by a diabolical and cowardly contrivance of the enemy. And that fits into a wider sort of narrative around underwater weapons throughout much of the early part of the 19th century. They developed this nickname for which they're referred to a lot throughout the 19th century. I was playing around with some engrams on Google, and it's quite interesting to see the various spikes. But this term, of course, is infernal machines. And this speaks to a number of different things. Part of this is around the fact that these are explosive weapons. And in the early part of this period, that sets them apart from usual naval guns or ordnance, which fires solid shot. But there's also something else in this notion of them being diabolical, of it sort of almost hellish type weapons. And they're very much seen as being beyond the pale. And this is true sort of throughout much of the 19th century. But as these weapons begin to be used far more, attitudes do start to change. And this is particularly true through the mid part of the 19th century. So they're very heavily used, obviously, in the American Civil War, which is well known. Less well known is the extent to which they're used by the Russians in the Crimean War. And you'll see on the screen an example of a Russian infernal machine, which was captured by or raised by the British, and then obviously it's nicely painted and everything else as almost a souvenir. And they actually weren't hugely effective in the Crimean War. As a sort of a slight aside, the most notable wounds caused by them were where two British admirals, one of these mines had been pulled up, and the two senior British admirals in the Baltic Fleet decided they wanted to take it apart on the quarterdeck. And of course, they dismantled, as they were dismantling the mine, the senior admiral turned around to his second in command and said, basically, oh, look, this is the fuse, this is how it should go off. And he pressed basically the switch. And of course, the thing wasn't a complete dud, and it blew up in his face. It didn't go off properly, but I think that the wounds to the pride of these officers, at least, was very notable, and it caused considerable amusement in London. But this widespread use of these weapons begins to change perceptions on how they're viewed. And this plays out quite nicely in a paper given in 1879 to the Royal United Services Institute. Lord Dunley, who was a an old school Royal Navy officer, gave the paper, and he expresses very much the traditional Royal Navy view, suggesting that, even going so far as to suggest that those caught deploying underwater weapons should be shot, that these weapons are too far beyond the pale. And it's partly about the harm that's caused by these weapons, the way they offer a sudden and sort of dramatic kind of death potentially to sailors. But it's even more than that. It's a moral judgment about the type of weapon. And as he puts it here, and I think this is quite a nice quote, the vague but fatal epithet of un-English came to attach to men who used a deadly weapon but withdrew themselves from the fray. And if we sort of pull that apart a little bit, it's quite interesting, because the use of the deadly weapon is not necessarily the problem in his eyes. It's the use of the deadly weapon whilst withdrawing yourself from the fray. So you can use a weapon which causes sort of mortal wounds, but you can only do so if you yourself are in harm's way. And that fits in to some of the comments made by Mahan, and we'll see fits in again later. Now, this approach and these ideas presented by Lord Dunley were actually rejected in the lecture theatre at Rusey by a new breed of officers, who in this case was exemplified by Arthur Wilson, who goes on to be the head of the Royal Navy much later on. But he was a torpedo officer, and he suggested that there was no way that a weapon which was being used by so many navies could be described as being unfair. So there's this sense of, on one side, that this is not fair because of the way that the weapon operates, and on another side saying, well, actually, it being simply used allows it and gives it a certain status and standing. Okay, moving on, because I'm realizing I'm taking up more time than I needed to. So up until this point, we've generally been talking about what I would nowadays refer to as mines, naval mines, solid cases of explosives that go bang if a ship bumps into them. And even here, they were very technologically limited, largely by the way in which they were laid. So at this point, mines are very difficult to lay, and as such, it means they're only ever laid in places very close to the enemy's port, or your own port, but largely off an enemy's port. And from the 1870s onwards, there's a series of technological changes which spark these kind of responses to underwater weapons. The first of these is obviously the development of the torpedo, and we've got a picture of an early design of the Whitehead torpedo. Now, the attitude towards torpedoes within the Royal Navy was, I think, fair to say, mixed. They were embraced as a technology, but at the same time, there was quite a strong response against them, largely because of their strategic impact. And as late as the 1890s, the first Sea Lord could rage that no man ever did his country a worse service than Robert Whitehead, who was the inventor of the torpedo. And this is largely because of the way it empowers small navies against large navies. But there is still this underlying sense of the fact that this is it's not a fair weapon. But there were no claims really about them being inhumane, or the idea that they should be banned. The other developments which we'll go on to look at are, of course, submarines, which developed really from the 1890s, and mines once they gain far more prominence because they get a new type of, basically a way of laying them, which allows them to be laid far more widely. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to a couple of examples, thinking about where there's discussion around banning or limiting the use of mines, and how that plays into this question about sort of humanity and the harm done. And the first of these is basically where we started. It's the First Hague Peace Conference of 1899. And in their initial sort of proposal for the conference, the Russians include a proposal to ban submarines. And this is sort of fits into the wider attempts which are going on within that proposal to both limit naval expenditure and, as they see it, to sort of apply principles of humanity to naval warfare. And this comes through in other areas within the proposal. Now, it's quite interesting because the Royal Navy, a little like torpedoes, is not immediately sold on submarines. They adopt them, they buy quite a lot of them. But, and I think it's kind of summed up in this quote by a leading Royal Navy submariner early on. He said that the submarine, in comparison with ordinary vessels, is something insidious. So there's that kind of cultural challenge posed by a submarine. But even despite this, the Royal Navy was actually rather taken aback by the Russian proposal to ban submarines. As the Director of Naval Intelligence put it, as the submarine boat will use the same weapon, i.e. the torpedo, as the above-water torpedo boat, and its crew will probably run just as much risk as the crew of the latter, it is not seen why the use of the submarine boat is less humane than that of the torpedo boat. Now, again, you're getting this sort of repetition of the fact that the weapon is the same, therefore the damage done to another ship or that the crew of another ship is going to be the same. But the crucial part is this sort of the second caveat within this, which is that the crew will probably run just as much risk as a crew of a torpedo boat. The implication being that if the crew of the submarine didn't run any risk, then the weapon would not be humane. So it's not merely the injury caused, it's the way in which that injury is caused. Now, the Royal Navy was quite happy to see submarines banned, and as such, they broadly supported the idea at the conference, but it didn't get up because of opposition from the French and the Americans in particular. If we then go on to the next technological issue, which comes up at the Second Hague Conference in 1907, and that is the issue of mines. And in many ways, they are actually more problematic than submarines. Mines have been around for a long time, but as I say, this new depth-taking apparatus that allows them to be laid far more widely means that suddenly in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5, they have a major impact, both in terms of sinking warships, but also in terms of the impact on neutral vessels, both warships and merchant. And it's this impact on neutrals and non-combatants that really drives the reaction. The Royal Navy objects very strongly to mines on cultural grounds, much more strongly so than submarines or torpedoes. But it's this question of the impact on neutrals and non-combatants that drives this question, the broader issue around whether or not they should be banned. As the Chinese delegation noted to the conference, it is calculated that from 500 to 600 of our countrymen in pursuit of their peaceful occupations have met a cruel death through these dangerous engines. And this impact on peaceful non-combatants and the harm caused to them is what sets this apart from the other discussions. And the British pushed very hard for an agreement at the conference on these grounds, and the grounds were actually almost universally accepted in principle. However, opposition led by Germany and the United States on grounds of military necessity meant that whilst there was a convention limiting the use of mines, actually it was so vague and had sort of massive loopholes in it that it was virtually meaningless. Okay, so just to wrap up, because I'm sort of beginning to run out of time. The experiences of the pre-First World War period highlight a number of overlapping and at times kind of contradictory themes in sort of surrounding this question of the moral acceptability of weapons. The basic nature of underwater weapons means that they actually rarely cause considerable differences to sort of different wounds to those caused by other forms of naval weaponry, i.e. naval artillery. If you think about it, and it's an explosive charge, it does cause slightly different wounds. It tends to be more shock wounds, less shrapnel type injuries, but the majority of certainly deaths and casualties caused at sea happens where a ship sinks. And okay, an underwater weapon is perhaps more likely to sink a ship than naval artillery, but they ultimately result in the same thing. So much of the focus is instead around this question of whether the wounds were caused in a fair fight. And the idea that's very prevalent and comes up again and again is that it's only acceptable to cause somebody harm if they have a chance to fight back. And that question is it's sort of reoccurring. It's never really explicitly stated, but you can see there's this interplay around this question of whether or not the weapon is treacherous. And it's contentious, and as I put here, it's evolving. So the attitudes earlier in the 19th century are very different from those later on. And as the new technologies come on stream, you're getting, again, differing responses to them. Within the Royal Navy, for much of this period, certainly by the first decade of the 20th century, most people viewed underwater weapons as somehow problematic in certain ways, potentially even un-English, to use the apocryphal phrase, or the phrase actually used by Lord Dunley earlier on. But there was not necessarily a sense that they ought to be actually banned or prohibited. Now, mining does add a very different kind of angle, and I think this is probably where it's going to have overlap into what Elena's going to talk about, and that is the idea of who is being damaged or wounded by this. Up until this point, it's always been accepted that underwater weapons are only really used against naval vessels, and as such will only impact military personnel. The idea of them being used against civilian vessels was in fact outright rejected by the Royal Navy. So it becomes quite clear that the wounds it's permissible to inflict on military personnel are fundamentally different to those that could be inflicted upon civilians. And this is something that plays out in the First World War, and I was going to talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to cut it off there, and we can perhaps discuss it a little bit more in some questions at the end.
So if you are watching, or if you're in the audience here, are there any questions? Oh, there's one being formed. All right, I'll ask a question. I really love this paper, and I'm really keen to chat more with you about this, because I'm trying to work on dum-dum bullets in very similar ways as you're trying to frame the humanitarian discourse, or the ways in which the morality of a technological adoption or adaptation, and the idea of the wounds, the suffering, the consequence of use were being framed in the 19th century. And the ideas are so similar. This notion of it's okay if it's a military weapon being used to a military end, and this notion of there needs to be an equality of potential damage plays a part. And then, but one of the things that keeps repeating in the dum-dum discourse is unnecessary suffering. Somehow that the weapon being used because of the wounds it creates is doing more than what humanity should allow. Do you see similar kinds of ideas coming out in these submarines and submarine weaponry?
Actually, not hugely, because of the fact that I think actually, if a mine or a torpedo hits a ship and it sinks, that is the sort of the greatest amount of suffering that can be caused. These weapons are not, they don't really play into the question of sort of unnecessary cruelness or cruelty, because of the impact that they have tends to actually be similar, although in a different degree, to that of conventional accepted naval ordnance. The impact that happens if a high explosive shell hits a ship is quite unpleasant enough. There's not actually a huge amount of difference if a mine hits a ship. There is a kind of sense of unfairness, which I think is the bigger issue. But even broadly within this sense of underwater weapons, you do get at times an indication that it's almost striking below the belt. Anything that hits underwater is therefore not fair. Now, I think that fades out quite quickly. That's an earlier 19th century issue. But that is, I guess, as close as it gets. The actual harm done by underwater weapons tends to be remarkably similar to that done by other types of ordnance. And therefore, I guess it doesn't quite play across on the same way that say dum-dum bullets do.
Thank you, that's really useful. Are there any other questions? I've got one over here, Bernadette.
I'm thinking of the fact that in all these debates, convictions about morality, how are we to now anticipate future debates concerning drone warfare? The employment of drone, the employment of, say, mysterious weapons that are individually harmed diplomats.
Mm-hmm.
It's all in the conversation at the moment. Are we going to see the same debates with no ultimate conclusion?
So that's about drones and the similarities of the use of the ideas of morality and law. Maybe that's a question that we should wait for after Elena's talk, because she's going to talk more about the consequences of the submarine discussions. So are you happy to leave that for the next speaker?
Yep, very happy to both talk about it and talk about it a little bit later on.
Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions about there's one. Oh, there's one in the chat. All right. It's Elena's one. Can you see that, Richard?
Mention of concerns of submarine attacks on commerce. There's famously a couple of people who talk about it, most notably Admiral Jackie Fisher sort of suggests that this might happen. Most of the time it's rejected. I found quite a nice comment actually about torpedo boats attacking commerce in the 1880s and 1890s, and again the Royal Navy saying basically this would be seen as barbarism and piracy. There's no way that this will ever happen, which I guess does to an extent play into the idea of underwater weapons tend to be more extreme than any kind of gun. So you could potentially fire a gun at a ship and it would then stop and you could then capture it as a prize. If you fire a torpedo at a ship, it tends to be all over quite quickly. So I guess there is that slight sense of degree there, that torpedoes were very much seen as weapons focused on naval combatants rather than merchantmen. But broadly speaking, there's pretty much a consensus, I think, in Britain, and I think more broadly in Germany and France as well, that actually submarines are not likely to be used as commerce warfare. And that continues through until 1915.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to the notions of the seas should be open for commerce. That's the one thing that all these great industrial powers can all agree on, that needs to be protected. And of course, it's one of the first and most important things to shift in the First World War too, I think. So thank you so much, Richard. That was really enlightening and really useful.
All right, I'm so delighted to be here this afternoon with you. And I want to thank very briefly the organizers, I think Mathieu, Jeremy, and Tom, if I understood correctly. And also I wanted to thank Richard for sharing the session and for setting me up for success by prefacing my paper perfectly as though we had planned it, basically. So my talk is based on a dissertation chapter, and my dissertation is broadly interested in weapons prohibitions in international law, and in particular, how these weapons prohibitions were negotiated in what I call the foundational period of that body of law between the 1860s and the 1920s. And the paper I'm sharing with you today is specifically about the debates on submarines in the 1920s. And it's the only case study in the dissertation of a weapon whose prohibition was attempted in a sort of sustained way, but that failed in the end. So, oops, sorry. So when I began archival research on the topic, it was precisely this failure of the prohibition and then the subsequent regulation and normalization of submarines under international law that I thought was what interested me. So I was curious to excavate a lost way of looking at submarines, long gone today, of course, as submarines themselves and the discourse about them have changed dramatically, as Richard also just said earlier. And so in the archives, while I took delight in seeing submarines in newly problematic, critical, and in some ways also foreign ways, in the archive, I was really drawn to another observation. Because earlier discussions about pariah weapons in the 1860s and 1890s, mostly about bullets, had used the legal concepts of useless suffering and unnecessary cruelty to draw the line between lawful and unlawful weapons. This vocabulary persisted through the First World War and until this day, following around the technologies that first evoked it. But the debate about submarines, I noticed, was different. No longer confined in their effects to wounding an identifiable part of a soldier's body, opponents of submarines claimed that submarines injured the entire world at large. In other words, the submarine debate placed the topic of weapons prohibitions in the context of geopolitics and especially interwar European imperialism. And because what the following is a conceptual history and not an institutional history or a history of events, I want to very briefly give the broad outlines of what happened in the submarine debates in the interwar years. So the first thing I want to say is that yet again, as in the 19th century, as Richard said, British policymakers were really the ones pushing for her prohibition of submarines under international law, while conversely, French statesmen were among the most vigorous defenders of the use of submarines in international warfare. And then the second thing I want to note is that the back and forth over submarines played out in journals, newspapers, in scholarly conferences, and international diplomatic conferences. Right after the First World War, submarines had been prohibited for the defeated powers at the peace conferences ending the war. And then the matter came up most contentiously again at the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 22. And what follows draws on the sources that have arisen from this vast array of settings. So I'll proceed in three parts. The first part will be on wounding the body in the foundational period of international weapons law, particularly between the 1860s and the 1890s. And here I will really just very briefly, almost irresponsibly briefly, set the scene to contrast what comes later. Then in part two, I will be providing a conceptual history of how opponents of submarines after the First World War staked their claims about the unlawfulness of submarine warfare. And then I hope I will get to three, otherwise we can do that in the Q&A, which is on how proponents of submarines, most notably French politicians, but also US American ones, argued in favor of submarines based on arguments about connecting their imperial possessions. So a bit of background on what came before. In the 18th and 19th centuries, contested weapons were negotiated using the concept of unnecessary suffering. I am providing two examples here, which are meant to give a flavor of the language, but they're by no means exhaustive. At the top, we see an excerpt of Emile de Vatel's 1758 treatise on the law of nations. In it, he explains that poisoned weapons are prohibited under the laws of nature as the enemy's inevitable death, once already incapacitated and no longer able to fight, exceeds what is necessary and therefore legitimate in war. The employment of poisoned weapons was also useless, Vatel points out here, due to the arms race their introduction would induce, and at the end, everyone would be at the same footing again, just warfare would be more brutal. And at the bottom, just to show sort of the chronological range and pervasiveness of this language of unnecessary suffering, we see an excerpt to much the same effect by the liberal 19th century Swiss international lawyer Johann Caspar Bluntschli, arguing that weapons that cause useless suffering and unnecessary cruelty are prohibited. Bluntschli here turned to the human body as the arbiter of lawfulness or unlawfulness of weapons. So some time passes, and with the first international codifications of the laws of war in the 1860s, the legal concepts of useless suffering and unnecessary cruelty that had been around both in Enlightenment scholars' treatises as well as in the works of liberal reformers of the 19th century enter the new sphere of international conferences, which back then were just ever so haphazardly emerging. So they were not yet as much of a unremarkable mainstay of international affairs as they are today. The Declaration of St. Petersburg of 1868, which prohibited the use in war of explosive bullets under 400 grams, justified the prohibition by referring to the rule that the object of war, quote, would be exceeded by the employment of arms which uselessly aggravate the sufferings of disabled men or render their death inevitable. So very similar to the Vattel excerpt I shared. And in the context of the dum-dum bullet controversy 30 years later in the 1890s, and I know Mattia is working on this and I'm excited to exchange more about this, the concepts of unnecessary suffering rose to even further urgency, I would argue, due not least to the development of military surgery and the X-ray in 1895. So here at the bottom, the photo is a very early X-ray made by Paul von Bruns, who was one of the surgeons in Germany trying to prohibit dum-dum bullets. Yeah, so this dum-dum bullet debate revolved around expanding bullets designed by British Army engineers for use in frontier warfare in British India, bolstered by new technologies to mend and see, as well as see through, as in the case of X-rays, the human body. The human body in pain became even more central then, as legitimate violence came to be uneasily suspended between military necessity, humanity in war, and surgeons' ability to mend wounded bodies. So this, all too briefly, was the world before the First World War, and now I will transition into the post-World War I moment. So of course, the First World War had led to huge disappointments in the power of law to avoid the horrors of warfare, particularly German unlimited submarine warfare, German use of gas warfare, and so on. And here we have the American political scientist sort of reflecting on the First World War and saying that too much should not be expected of the rules of warfare. They will not mitigate the horrors of war. And this captures this moment in the 1920s where at the same time as there was such disappointment and lack of confidence in the power of law, there was also a sense of particular urgency. And those two oftentimes went uneasily with one another. So this concept or this milieu of uncertainty about the power of law was the context in which the prohibition of submarines was negotiated. And this is where my argument about a shift in scale from the pre-war to the interwar comes in. I provided the extremely brief overview of weapons prohibitions in the 18th and 19th centuries and the centrality of the human body to them to highlight the conceptual innovations of the debate over submarines in the 1920s. Part of this shift from body to world was due to the nature of submarine warfare itself, which was almost invisible to the human eye, as this warfare British newspaper article from the Bystander points out. That's here in the top right-hand corner of the slide. The shift had to do too with the targets of German unlimited submarine warfare: military ships, merchant ships, and even passenger lines. Over the course of the 1920s, I argue, the world and its veins, its shipping routes, emerged as the central locus of suffering and challenged the centrality of the human body. The final report of the US Advisory Committee to the Washington Conference, of which I pasted a clipping at the top here, is a good example of this discursive shift. The report condemned unlimited submarine warfare and elevated the wounded party from only the enemy to the entire world. This extrapolation, the report held, had to do with the growing interdependence of the world through trade and travel. In a world, quote, so dependent on ocean transportation that shipping is essential to livelihood, unlimited submarine warfare would mean that vast populations would starve. Harry Knapp, a retired US Navy officer, made much the same point in his journal commentary on the Second Treaty of the Washington Conference, to which I will get to in a bit. When he penned this commentary here at the bottom, Knapp already looked back upon a career that included service on the Joint Army and Navy Board for Defense of the Panama Canal, ruler of Santo Domingo, military representative of the US in Haiti, and command of various military ships and fleets. He was a commentator, in other words, well familiar with maritime interconnectivity and US imperialism. Writing here in the Political Science Quarterly, Knapp lamented that, quote, unlimited marine warfare penalized not only the enemy belligerent, but the whole world by the destruction of shipping instead of the transfer of its ownership and control contemplated by the recognized laws of war. While the laws of war maintained that enemy property could be taken in wartime, the sinking of merchant ships and the loss of goods to the sea went beyond redistributing property and was hence unacceptable. Unlimited submarine warfare on commerce, wherein the ship along with its cargo was sunk, meant that its goods were lost to the world. In the text of other commentators that I didn't include it here, the needs of human bodies and of global trade were closely interlinked. British Admiral Mark Kerr, writing in the New York Times in 1928, warned that Great Britain and Japan would cease to exist if their veins of sea commerce were cut. As the suffering body of the human combatant receded from view, global shipping routes and nation states took on human features, veins. Or, more to the point, empires took on human features, with seaborne connections acting as vital bloodstreams. Now, where did this new worldly discourse leave the wounded human body? I would argue that it occupied an ambivalent place in the 1920s, with some holding onto its centrality, while others argued for the primacy of trade interests. So as an example, Sir Henry Fleetwood Tullier, a British Army officer, rashly noted that it was, quote, a very cowardly thing for us to try to defend our merchant ships by this plea of non-combatants and women and children in ships. But not everyone was quite so cynical. And on the other hand, former counselor of the US Department of State, Chandler P. Anderson, in an editorial comment, insisted that the campaign to outlaw submarines was inspired by humane sentiments and the protection of lives rather than greed. Probably both mattered in the end, the property and the people. What was new was that the language of the wounded world was conscripted to police the boundary between lawful and unlawful means of wartime destruction. The status of submarines as weapons directed against world trade and travel found its expression in the concept of piracy. The submarine, the British delegate to the Washington Conference argued, was, quote, a weapon of murder and piracy and the drowning of non-combatants. This indictment was not contingent on the use or misuse of the machine, but rather it was constructed as being inevitable. Due to their size, due to their small size, and technological constraints, submarines could not be utilized to rescue non-combatants from sinking ships, even if the crew would have wanted to. At the same conference, also in Washington, former US Secretary of State Elihu Root declared that he felt that, quote, the man who was responsible for sinking the Lusitania committed an act of piracy, and that any further such acts should be prosecuted under that same category. and he would get his wish. So here is the Washington Treaty relating to the use of submarines, which I briefly touched on earlier. It's also referred to Treaty Number 2. And in brief, despite repeated British attempts to the contrary, submarines were not entirely prohibited by the Washington Conference. Instead, this treaty, which is also often referred to as the Root Resolution, codified the conceptualization of unlimited submarine warfare as piracy. The treaty stipulated that any person in the service of any power who shall violate any of those rules against German-style unlimited submarine warfare, whether or not such a person is under orders of a government superior, shall be deemed to have violated the laws of war and shall be liable to trial and punishment as if for an act of piracy, etc. So this bottom line amounted to a regulation and not a prohibition of submarines under existing law of war rules, along with the repercussion of prosecution as if for an act of piracy, meaning that violators could be prosecuted under the common jurisdiction of all states in the world. Okay, so I will very briefly talk about connecting empire. As I said earlier, the French statesmen were among the biggest opponents of submarine warfare in the interwar years. And their defense was very much based on an argument about military necessity. The extent of the French interwar empire, they argued, and the weakness of the French surface fleet made submarines militarily necessary. The logic of the French position emerges of the sources displayed here on the slide. Head of the French delegation in Washington, Albert Sarraut, noted at the third meeting of the conference that, quote, France must have the weapon she needs to defend her possessions, just as she must have the weapon necessary to the safety of her transports and her lines of communication between the mother country and her colonies, both near and distant. To him, for the task of maintaining France's interwar empire, the submarine was seen to be indispensable. Perhaps more disturbingly, the connection between the Hexagon and French colonies and mandates was important for the transport not only of goods, but of people as well. So French strategists argued. In wartime, France's African colonies would furnish a, quote, veritable reservoir of troops, not only so far as Morocco and Algeria were concerned, but even the Senegal, the Congo, and Madagascar. The perceived need for reinforcements from French colonies stemmed from continued and, of course, prescient suspicions of German aggression and the numerical disadvantage of French troops relative to German ones. In addition to troops, France would also depend upon raw materials from French colonies, particularly grains from Algeria and Tunisia. But this defense of the submarine was not an exclusively French position. To US officials too, submarines were important for the maintenance of the interwar empire. A report drafted by the US Advisory Committee in Washington pointed out that, quote, submarines acting legitimately from bases in our distant possessions would harass and greatly disturb an enemy attempting operations against them. In the particular case of the Philippines, the retention of a large submarine force was seen to aid the United States in holding its outlying possessions. Maintaining a submarine fleet was seen as prudent, as the cost, human and monetary, of reconquest would be much higher than investing in a submarine fleet upfront. And of course, just the same emphasis on the importance of the connection of European states to their empires had a different resonance for Great Britain because of its large surface marine and dominant merchant fleet. So for Britain, actually, submarines were a danger rather than safeguards to its global supply lines. Herbert Richmond, who would become professor of imperial and naval history at Cambridge University, emphasized this point in a 1932 essay. The British Empire depended on its strength on control of the seas, just as France and the United States. Richard argued that, quote, security of those roads is as indispensable a condition to the security of each and all of those scattered islands as security of the railways, the roads, rivers, and canals within the territory of a continental state. So while the different powers in the interwar years came at this aim of safeguarding their imperial possessions and supply lines from different levels, above the sea in the case of Britain, below the sea in the case of France, they all shared this similar goal. Okay, so in conclusion, what I found during my research was interwar submarines as a type of shape-shifting technology whose portrayal and characterization varied hugely depending on the geopolitical perspective from which they were described. So from the perspective of British opponents of submarines, submarines were piratical, barbaric machines, whereas for French proponents of submarines, they were defensive safeguards for the hexagon. The other thing I found interesting, as I said in my sources, is this shift from the body and its sort of attendant concept of unnecessary suffering and useless cruelty in the 1860s through the 1890s to then this new discourse where the world emerges as the new relevant body of suffering. And of course, to some extent, that is because in submarine warfare, victims disappear in the world's oceans. And the question is, and it's a true question, whether and to what extent really bodies disappeared in the discourse in the 1920s, to what extent they also shapeshifted and found new forms. And to what extent, of course, they also still remain central, for example, in discourses about the danger of civilians in cities to gas attacks and so on. So to some extent, in other words, these conceptual shifts seem to follow the technology more so than any kind of chronological timeline. Yeah, and then in the end, of course, in terms of the history of events, submarines in the 1920s were not prohibited, but rather they were regulated under international law, which arguably has also led to their normalization today, where no one thinks twice about them again or anymore. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena, for that wonderful talk. And the two talks really did speak so wonderfully to each other. So I'm just going to see if I can get Richard on screen as well. So, and get the chats up. Are there any questions? I've got one here, one of my students who's working on piracy in the 19th century. So this is Katie.
Yes, I have a pirate question for you. To what extent do you feel like the use of the term piracy is more of like a allusion to the concept of their goods being like stolen and, you know, by the process of being sunk? Or do you think that was there evidence of real piracy as an issue?
So as opposed to the wounding of bodies and the loss of life, it's the wounding to the goods and the stealing of the goods. So was the piracy use in the 1920s, when Elihu talks about this, was this about the goods, or was it about the fact that there was also was it more of a symbolic use of the word piracy, as in like these things and these people have been stolen from us, or was there actual a lot of actual piracy taking place?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And in fact, it was disputed even in the 1920s whether real piracy was taking place. And I think in short, my answer to you would be that it was both. You know, Elihu Root would use the term of piracy symbolically because it carries those layers of conceptual meaning. And you know much more about this from your research than I do. But it also has a very particular legal meaning. And actually, that is exactly why it was contested whether unlimited submarine warfare was real piracy, because normally piracy is done by non-state actors, or it has to be a non-state actor. And so because German unlimited submarine warfare, while happening in violation of the laws of war, the commanders of these German submarines, they were still following government orders. So they were state actors in a way. And this was one of the ways in which this question was debated, whether actual piracy was taking place.
Richard, you had something you wanted to add?
Oh no, I was potentially gonna ask a question if that was okay.
Yeah, please ask.
Really fascinating paper, thank you. And it was exactly kind of where I was going to go, and so I thought I would raise a question which kind of I was thinking as I was going through this, which is actually the interest in banning or prohibiting the use of submarines over regulating them. And this is interesting because submarines can choose what they fire at. So a submarine can fire only at military vessels, or it can fire at civilian vessels and military vessels. So regulation seems like the obvious way to go. Whereas mines, as the counterpoint from what I was talking about, don't get to choose what they hit, as it were. If a mine hits if a merchant vessel hits a mine, it goes bang just as much as an enemy battleship. So I was wondering why is it that do you think that you see this real push for prohibition of submarines as opposed to regulation? And then also why is, and I don't know if you're in a position to comment at all, but why do they then not look at other technologies that logically would seem more problematic?
I'll try my hands at the first part of the question first, because the second one I think is almost unanswerable because it's so good. But I think, I mean, what you say about mines, that they were supposed to be prohibited because they don't get to choose what they fire at. I've seen much of the same argument made about submarines, and the way in which this argument goes is that interwar submarines had no chance anymore against the new military vessels, the surface ships that were being built in the interwar years, and that submarines would only be effective against merchant ships and passenger lines. So because they almost inherently were predestined to only be effective in unlawful scenarii, that's why they should be prohibited. I think that's at least partially what's going on there. The other thing is just also, I mean, what the sort of Quincy Wright quote gets at, right? So why prohibit rather than regulate? In part because regulation didn't work very well in the First World War. On the other hand, prohibition also didn't work very well in the First World War. Yeah, it's a really good question. And why didn't they tackle more problematic technologies? I mean, there was this attempt of banning warfare from the air, like military aircraft in the 1920s at the League of Nations, and it was just too militarily useful. No one wanted to get rid of it. Is the depressing answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Well, I'll finish off with one. I really love the idea of the shift from the body to the world, and one of the things I was really struck by was when Richard was talking about not even imagining that anyone would target trade in the way that you could possibly target trade with these weapons, right? And that therefore mines were so problematic because they did they didn't discriminate between what they had. Something hit, it would blow up. Do you see a sense in, because Elijah Root and Quincy Wright we're all products of a pre-war legal system, and James Brown Scott was too. So these really important voices in the 1920s who have experienced this enormously challenging, intellectually and conceptually challenging conflict. Do you see them struggling with rethinking what humanity or what states are now capable of, and that's why they're trying to mobilize something like piracy and damaging the world and damaging the peace of the world and the trade of the world.
Yeah, I mean, this is very inspirational. I want to sort of contextualize these people more in their historical context. But I think you're onto something. Like in a sense, the treaty that comes out of the Washington Conference is this last attempt to tame this new technology that has risen to unprecedented usefulness, terrible usefulness in the First World War, to tame it with an old legal category. So there are these meetings of the Grotius Society, which is this, I don't know if you're familiar, but it's this British society. I think it's founded, I need to look this up, but either during the war or right after the war.
1915.
Okay, during the war, sort of like in defense of international law, and there are papers given there sort of talking about what Germany did in the First World War. The Barbary states did this in the Middle Ages, and yet we haven't used international law effectively still to hem this in. And I forget the author now, but this paper basically made this case that now is really the time to lock down piracy through international law and through an international treaty. So I think they very much see themselves in a continuity of practice. Yeah.
Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to jump in because I think that there's some really interesting stuff there, even looking at people like Robert Lansing's responses and how he goes very much the other way and becomes some of his stuff around military necessity that I was looking at, and I didn't end up managing to fit into this because it was going to come towards the end, that really shocks the British. And they're like, oh my Lord, he's gone completely to the other extreme and saying basically you can do anything you want as long as it's required by the military. And I think the other element that's playing in the American side of things at this point, which is coming actually from some other work I'm doing, but is around justifying their own actions in terms of the decisions of 1917 of going into the war, because the crucial role that sort of unrestricted submarine warfare plays in American decisions to enter the war, actually you see it coming back and feeding back into the debates later on as American decisions to enter the war begin to get challenged in the interwar period. There's a requirement then for this to actually be really serious to justify the decisions we took before. So you almost see sort of retrospective justification going on. So that was something that immediately came to mind when I was listening to some of Elena's stuff. So I thought that was really interesting.
It just, I mean, this war, this total war, this global war it changed so much conceptually in terms of it jarred and it really made people think very seriously about how they're going to be able to reshape something post World War I. I just wanted to go back to Bernadette's question earlier, and I just wanted to ask you both whether you, and being a historian myself, I understand that this is an impossible question for us to answer as historians, but we should at least maybe try any similarities sort of between the kinds of ways in which these weapons and these technologies and the suffering in the bodies that were being affected by this has similarities or is different from how the contemporary debates around the use of drones functions today. I'm sure the audience would greatly appreciate our learned thoughts, or rather your learned thoughts on this. So,
Elena, do you want to go first?
Well, I want to use this question as an excuse to test an idea that an intuition that I've had for a long time, and it's irresponsible because I can't prove it through archival work, but I think it's related to your question, Martia. So I think one of the ways in which I think both the submarine debates, but in general, the way in which weapons prohibitions both were negotiated, but then especially their effect in warfare are similar to the effect of weapons prohibition today, is that they make it much harder to critique lawful violence in war. So, it becomes, our way of grappling with violence in war has become so limited to critiquing war crimes, when more capacious ways of challenging violence in war it has become elusive, I think. And there are people working on this, Sam Boyne's new book, for example, but I think those are sort of fringe positions and very rare. And when you look at, for example, Syria, the way in which the media reports on it, it's, a lot of attention is paid when it's a violation of international laws of war, international humanitarian law, sorry, that was the 19th century person speaking. But the quote unquote lawful loss of life in war is not getting enough attention. And I wonder if there's a causal relationship to the way in which we've legalized warfare.
I think you might be right. Richard, do you have any?
Well, I certainly don't have anything that's that profound, I'm afraid. I think it's a really interesting space, and some of the specific work that I've been done previously to this, which focused on mines, and one of the things that I found most interesting is this question of autonomy, and the idea that mines are effectively the first autonomous weapons, and that difficulty of how you sort of engage with the question where the human actor gets effectively removed from, taken off the loop, to use the military phrase. And one of the things that I think is rather depressing from what I sort of looked at in terms of the historical side of things is that the military necessity and the value of the technology in terms of it as a weapon system rapidly overrode any sort of humanitarian type sort of drive or requirement. And even where they did sort of produce a convention at the 1907 Hague, it was clearly designed in order to be basically useless, and it was acknowledged as much immediately afterwards, and it so proved. But it doesn't necessarily, for me at least, speak particularly positively towards the idea of being able to place similar limits on far more dangerous looking technologies into the future. So I'm sorry about an even more negative point to end on, and it's certainly not.
I was going to add to that Dirk Moses has just written this really excellent expose on the use of words like legal use of words like genocide, and how they've actually made us blind to the violent suffering and the violence of war more generally, that we're so fixated on making sort of on quantifying or even qualifying the violence. We are not really looking at the victims or the perpetrators in any real depth and with any real critique. And it's a really powerful response to the violence we allow in our world. And it's also a really important way of thinking about the violence that humanity has allowed in the past as well. So on that point, can I thank you? I can't thank you both enough for these really enlightening and beautifully connected talks. The good news is we've taped them, and they will be made available online for everyone to share in future, for good or bad. But we will be in touch very soon to let you know those links, and we have lots of wonderful talks planned for the coming weeks and months. And I'm just going to turn the camera around and give you all a traditional thank you. So if we could thank our speakers. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Hosting us.
And get some sleep.
Yes.
Bye.